Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is from chapter 314. Chapter 314. When seeing a dying animal, a man feels a sense of horror. Substance similar to his own is perishing before his eyes. But when it is a beloved and intimate human being that is dying, besides this horror at the extinction of life, there is a severance, a spiritual wound, which, like a physical wound, is sometimes fatal and sometimes heals, but always aches and shrinks at an external irritating touch. After Prince Andrew's death, Natasha and Princess Mary alike felt this. Drooping in spirit and closing their eyes before the menacing cloud of death that overhung them, they dared not look life in the face. They carefully guarded their open wounds from any rough and painful contact. Everything, a carriage passing rapidly in the street, a summons to dinner, the maid's enquiry what dress to prepare, or worse still, any word of insincere or feeble sympathy, seemed an insult, painfully irritated the wound, interrupting that necessary quiet in which they both tried to listen to the stern and dreadful choir that still resounded in their imagination, and hindered their gazing onto those mysterious limitless vistas that for an instant had opened out before them. Only when alone together were they free from such outrage and pain. They spoke little even to one another, and when they did, it was of very unimportant matters. Both avoided any allusion to the future. To admit the possibility of a future seemed to them an insult to his memory. Still more carefully did they avoid anything relating to him who was dead. It seemed to them that what they had lived through and experienced could not be expressed in words, and that any reference to the details of his life infringed the majesty and sacredness of the mystery that had been accomplished before their eyes. Continued abstention from speech, and constant avoidance of everything that might lead up to the subject, this halting on all sides at the boundary of what they might not mention, brought before their minds with still greater purity and clearness what they were both feeling. But pure and complete sorrow is as impossible as pure and complete joy. Princess Mary, in her position as absolute and independent arbiter of her own fate, and guardian and instructor of her nephew, was the first to be called back to life from that realm of sorrow in which she had dwelt for the very first fortnight. She received letters from her relations to which she had to reply. The room in which little Nicholas had been put was damp, and he began to cough. Alpatych came to Yaroslav with reports of the state of their affairs, and with advice and suggestions that they should return to Moscow to the house of the Vozdenievka Street, which had remained uninjured and needed only slight repairs. Life did not stand still, and it was necessary to live. Hard as it was for Princess Mary to emerge from the realm of secluded contemplation in which she had lived till then, and sorry and almost ashamed as she felt to leave Natasha alone, yet the cares of life demanded her attention, and she involuntarily yielded to them. She went through the accounts with Alpatych, conferred with de Sales about her nephew, and gave orders and made preparations for the journey to Moscow. Natasha remained alone, and from the time Princess Mary began making preparations for departure, held aloof from her too. Princess Mary asked the Countess to let Natasha go with her to Moscow, and both parents gladly accepted this offer, for they saw their daughter losing strength every day, and thought that a change of scene and the advice of Moscow doctors could be good for her. "I'm not going anywhere," Natasha replied when this was proposed to her. "Do please just leave me alone." And she ran out of the room, with difficulty restraining from tears of vexation and irritation rather than of sorrow. After she felt herself deserted by Princess Mary and alone in her grief, Natasha spent most of the time in her room by herself, sitting huddled up feet and all in the corner of the sofa, tearing up and twisting something with her slender, nervous fingers, and gazing intently and fixedly at whatever her eyes chanced to fall upon. This solitude exhausted and tormented her, but she was in absolute need of it. As soon as anyone entered, she got up quickly, changed her position and expression, and picked up a book or some sewing, evidently waiting impatiently for the intruder to go. She felt all the time as if she might at any moment penetrate that on which, with a terrible questioning too great for her strength, her spiritual gaze was fixed. One day toward the end of December, Natasha, pale and thin, dressed in a black woolen gown, her plaited hair negligently twisted into a knot, was crouched feet and all in the corner of her sofa, nervously crumpling and smoothing out the end of her sash while she looked at a corner of the door. She was gazing in the direction in which he had gone, to the other side of life. And that other side of life, of which she had never before thought, and which had formerly seemed to her so far away and improbable, was now nearer and more akin and more comprehensible than this side of life, where everything was either emptiness and desolation, or suffering and indignity. She was gazing where she knew him to be, but she could not imagine him otherwise than as he had been here. She now saw him again, as he had been at Miastchi, Troitsa, and at Yaroslav. She saw his face, heard his voice, repeated his words and her own, and sometimes devised other words they might have spoken. There he is, lying back in an armchair in his velvet cloak, leaning his head on his thin, pale hand. His chest is dreadfully hollow, and his shoulders raised. His lips are firmly closed. His eyes glitter, and a wrinkle comes and goes on his pale forehead. One of his legs twitches just perceptibly, but rapidly. Natasha knows that he is struggling with terrible pain. What is that pain like? Why does he have that pain? What does he feel? How does it hurt him? Thought Natasha. He noticed her watching him, raised his eyes, and began to speak seriously. "One thing would be terrible," said he, "to bind oneself forever to a suffering man. It would be a continual torture." And he looked searchingly at her. Natasha, as usual, answered before she had time to think what she would say. She said, "This can't go on. It won't. You will get well, quite well." She now saw him from the commencement of that scene, and relived what she then had felt. She recalled his long, sad, and severe look at those words, and understood the meaning of the rebuke and despair, and that protracted gaze. "I agreed," Natasha now said to herself, "that it would be dreadful if he always continued to suffer. I said it then only because it would have been dreadful for him, but he understood it differently. He thought it would be dreadful for me. He then still wished to live and feared death, and I said it so awkwardly and stupidly. I did not say what I meant. I thought quite differently. Had I said what I thought, I should have said, even if he had to go on dying, to die continually before my eyes, I should have been happy compared with what I am now. Now there is nothing, nobody." Did he know that? No, he did not and never will know it. And now it will never, never be possible to put it right. And now he again seemed to be saying the same words to her, only in her imagination, Natasha this time gave him a different answer. She stopped him and said, "Terrible for you, but not for me. You know that for me there is nothing in life but you, and to suffer with you is the greatest happiness for me." And he took her hand and pressed it as he had pressed in that terrible evening 4 days before his death. And in her imagination she said other tender and loving words, which she might have said then, but only spoke now. "I love thee, thee, I love, love," she said convulsively, pressing her hands and setting her teeth with a desperate effort. She was overcome by sweet sorrow, and tears were already rising in her eyes. Then she suddenly asked herself to whom she was saying this. Again, everything was shrouded in hard, dry perplexity. And again, with a strained frown, she peered toward the world where he was. And now it seemed to her she was penetrating the mystery. But at the instant when it seemed that the incomprehensible was revealing itself to her, a loud rattle of the door handle struck painfully on her ears. Dunyasha, her maid, entered the room quickly and abruptly with a frightened look on her face, showing no concern for her mistress. "Come to your papa at once, please," said she with a strange, excited look. "A misfortune. About Peter Ilyinich. A letter," she finished with a sob. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 314 of War and Peace. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, day 314. On the loss of a loved one. The body heals itself, but a soul's wound needs minding. When we suffer physical damage, the corporeal response is automatic. Our blood first clots and then dries, forming a protective scab to guard against germs. Next, the surrounding blood vessels open up to bring oxygen and nutrients to the wound. White blood cells attack any infection and begin repairing the wounded area. New tissue growth initiates as the damaged area is slowly rebuilt. Over time, the wound gets smaller and smaller, until all that is left is the memory of the original injury. Psychic injury, like that wrought by the loss of a loved one, is much more painful and lacks this automatic salutary response. We must summon our own curative powers. Fortunately, these powers do exist. Unfortunately, our mind often works against its own recuperation. In today's chapter, Princess Mary employs these powers to heal herself, while Natasha refuses their restorative blessings. Both Princess Mary and Natasha grieve at the death of Prince Andrew. The distinction between the two is that Princess Mary wisely leaves the excessive grieving behind. She does this by looking to life and the living. But pure and complete sorrow is as impossible as pure and complete joy, Tolstoy writes of Princess Mary's process. Princess Mary, in her position as absolute and independent arbiter of her own fate and guardian and instructor of her nephew, was the first to be called back to life. From that realm of sorrow in which she had dwelt for the first fortnight, she received letters from her relations to which she had to reply. The room in which Nikolushka had been put was damp, and he began to cough. Alpatych came to Yaroslav with reports on the state of their affairs, and with advice and suggestions that they should return to Moscow to the house on Voskinievska Street, which had remained uninjured and needed only slight repairs. Life did not stand still, and it was necessary to live. Hard as it was for Princess Mary to emerge from the realm of secluded contemplation in which she had lived till then, and sorry and almost ashamed as she felt to leave Natasha alone, yet the cares of her life demanded her attention, and she involuntarily yielded to them. So we see that Princess Mary rapidly restores her normal mental state by means of active social participation. Natasha, on the other hand, retreats further into herself. She remains alone. She dwells on thoughts of death and the dead. She even keeps looking at the very place where Andrew expired. All this serves only to rip open the scabs of memory and allows the blood of grief to flow freely. The death of a loved one hurts, more so than most things. But it is an event which no power can stop. The only power we truly exercise against it is how we react to it. Daily meditation. If fate can be overcome by tears, let us bring tears to bear upon it. Let every day be passed in mourning, every night be spent in sorrow instead of sleep. Let your breast be torn by your own hands, your very face attacked by them, and every kind of cruelty be practiced by your grief, if it will profit you. But if the dead cannot be brought back to life, however much we may beat our breasts, if destiny remains fixed and immovable forever, not to be changed by any sorrow, however great, and death does not loose its hold of anything that he once has taken away, then let our futile grief be brought to an end. Let us then steer our own course, and no longer allow ourselves to be driven to leeward by the force of our own misfortune. He is a sorry pilot who lets the waves wring his rudder from his grasp, who leaves the sails to fly loose, and abandons the ship to the storm. But he who boldly grasps the helm and clings to it until the sea closes over him deserves praise, even though he be shipwrecked. Seneca. Of Consolation to Marcia. All right, that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 314 of War and Peace. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for joining me. Tomorrow we're going to be reading and reflecting on day 315. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.